Hello, everybody. This is Nick Vlahos from Nick in the Morning at pjstar.com. This is Nick in the Morning, the podcast. Been a little while since we've done one, but we found the perfect guest to have on today, and that is Journal Star opinion page editor Mike Bailey. How are you, Michael?
I'm great. Thank you for having me today.
Just not good, but great.
Great.
Even with that.
It's an atypical day.
As far as?
Just for. It just is. Being here with you makes it a very special moment.
Oh, you're so sweet.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
For the 101st podcast, correct?
What's that?
This is the 101st podcast, correct?
For somebody, I guess. Not for me. I think this might be my 10th podcast.
Yeah, okay.
So, you know.
But we just celebrated the 100th last week, I believe.
I believe that was Steve Tarter's 100th podcast.
Oh, his own.
His
okay.
Personal one, yeah. Steve
I was going to say that would seem to suggest that you found 100 people more interesting than I am. So this is a new era, I suppose.
Steve is the podcast king. It's
He is
like
indeed.
he throws around podcasts like John D. Rockefeller used to throw around dimes. He does a heck of a job with it. You know what? It's even a good day even with the Cardinals mug that you brought into the studio today, which hold it up for the crowd. There you go. If you've got the video, you can see it.
This celebrates 2011 World Series victory, so, you know.
I know
the Cardinals are the most successful franchise in National League history, right?
I believe you're the one who always reminds me of that.
Second only to the Yankees
in
Major League Baseball.
That's what I've heard. But I know one franchise around here that's won a World Series since 2011. So
this is correct, although, you know, we see my beloved Cardinals standing atop the NL Central as we speak. So let's not discount that.
3 weeks into the season?
Young talent.
It's how you finish that counts, okay? And it's quality over quantity. I'll also add that part. Let's start out by just talking a little bit about your background. Where are you from? How did you get involved in journalism? You're from Springfield originally, correct?
Sure, I'm from Springfield. Born Halloween 1960. My mom held me on her lap while JFK was being elected president of the United States, and so, you know, born and raised in Springfield, very political town, as you know, far more political than Peoria.
Yes.
Went to Springfield Public Schools, Lanford High School, where I was a frustrated basketball player, shortest guy on the basketball team by 1 foot the last year I played. Wish I had some of your height.
I wish you did too, because you would have made better use of it than I did.
Graduated from Lanphier in 1979. Went to Illinois State University, where I ran track and also managed to get a degree. Shortly after that, I worked at the Bloomington Panagraph, moved up to Chicago and worked at a weekly paper in the suburbs there, and then ultimately matriculated down here to Peoria. I heard it was a great place to hide from one's creditors, so that's joking. So anyway, was hired here in 1985, 33 long years ago. Was hired as a general assignment reporter. 2 weeks after I got here, was placed on Night Cops, where I worked for the next year and a half. Then was made a schools reporter, where I worked for 4 years. Covering District 150 and every other school district around here. That was a true education beat then, and covered a lot of issues going back to Harry Whitaker as superintendent in District 150. Big break in my career came when I was sent to Ecuador to cover the kidnapping by Colombian guerrillas of Scott Heimdall, who was a Peoria native. I think they sent me because I was single and replaceable, and because I spoke a smattering of Spanish. That was a big break in my career. Spent 2 weeks there. Ended up interviewing the president of Ecuador, Rodrigo Borja, at the time, in Spanish. Came back to Peoria after Heimdall was released. Shortly thereafter, it was a watershed moment in Journal Star history. 7 editors retired on the same day. I got 3 editor job offers, rather. Chose the opinion page. That was 1991. So I was on the editorial board then, became opinion page editor in 2005, where I've been since. You know, I live in Washington, in the land of Lincoln, with my wife. Been married, got married the same year, 1991. So 27 years. I shouldn't forget that, should I?
Probably not, no.
Yeah. 2 kids, 2 grandkids, and here we are today. So,
it's gone by just like that.
Peoria's home.
Yep.
So
I understand that completely too, being a non-Peorian myself, but been here almost as well. I started here about the same time you did, not too long afterward, actually. I want to go back to that Scott Heimdall thing a little bit. How did that seems extraordinary to me, and I was here when it happened, that we would actually send some buddies, because a photographer went too, if I recall correctly.
Al Harkrader, the immortal Al Harkrader.
The one and only Al Harkrader. And you both went to Ecuador at the spur of the moment. How did this all come about?
Actually, it was not my story. I had volunteered my services, and the beat reporter, as I recall, on that, or not the beat reporter, but the reporter assigned to that story, was afraid of flying. Didn't want to fly.
First of all,
I didn't even have a passport.
There's probably some people that are not aware of who Scott Heimdall was and how this all came about. Maybe can you go over that just a little bit?
Scott Heimdall had been in the U.S. military, and he had he'd left the military and had moved to Ecuador to seek his fortune. They were in the jungles. They had crossed the border into Colombia, and they were mining the rivers there for gold and for whatever other precious metals they could find. One day they were kidnapped by Colombian guerrillas. And he was, oh gosh, I want to say he was, was in their custody for many, many months before the Journal-Star sent me down there, along with every television reporter in Peoria. I did not even have a passport at the time. Got a passport and my shots all in 24 hours. I was actually in Springfield trimming my parents' hedges when I got the call from Peoria saying, "We're sending you to Ecuador." And I said, "When?" And they said, "Tomorrow." So I had to drive immediately to Chicago and get a passport.
How easy was it to get a passport?
Well, Bob Michael smoothed the way for us, who was our congressman at the time, and then got the shots. And early the next morning, I was on a plane to Quito, which was quite an eye-opener.
Nice to have friends in high places.
That's right. That's right.
When you got down there, what'd you find?
It was a third world country, Banana Republic. I can remember when the initial things was being, they had armed. First of all, when you flew into the airport, there were armed guards there with, rifles over their shoulders, and you would see. And Quito is the capital of Ecuador. It's the capital city of highest altitude in the world, I believe. Straddles the equator. Beautiful city in its own way, very much like San Francisco, very, very hilly. But basic infrastructure problems, at least then. Hyperinflation. Armed soldiers on the. Working at intersections. I can remember taking a picture of a government building and having a soldier/policeman come up to me and tell me that taking photos of government buildings was illegal.
Interesting.
That sort of thing. It was very different. Just basic infrastructure. Public water systems, public sewer systems, that sort of thing. Public education. It was all, it was third world, which is sort of like 1950s America at that point. At that time. But I was very busy. We went to work reporting this story very early on, and I can remember being at Scott Heimdall's boss's office, and there was like an Uzi sitting in the corner, and I read a business card upside down on his boss's desk, and it was from a man who was advertising our services, and so the heading on the business card was International Hostage Rescue. And he named a price for that and that sort of thing. And so I thought on a lark I would call this person up. So I read the business card upside down and called him up. And he was an American soldier of fortune who was a fascinating character. He, I called him up. He looked like an Iowa farmer. He walks in the lobby of the Hotel Cologne in Quito, introduces himself. We spend the day with him. And, he was... in the international import-export business. He had entertained the Harlem Globetrotters when they were in town. He put on the embassy's annual 4th of July celebration. He owned a South American newspaper. His wife was an Ecuadorian doctor. By the way, that I play a little pool. He was sort of a pool hustler on the side. He did a little bit of everything. He claimed to have addressed the Republican National Convention in 1968 and 1972. He was a graduate of Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. He had been a former county sheriff.
Sounds like a character out of a book or something, like a Renaissance.
Sort of yeah, exactly. And he had, like I said, he had addressed the Republican National Convention on substance abuse issues. He had been a beach preacher in Virginia. It's very insistent that I'm not going to give you his name now, but very insistent that I not use his name in the newspaper. we spend the day with him. You know, I really didn't know what I was getting into. Hal Harkrader and I were you know, you kind of flying in the dark a little bit when you parachute into a foreign country where, you know, they speak a different language and all that sort of thing. Anyways, we spent the day with this guy, and he offered to take us into Colombia, into the jungle, and you know, talk directly to the Colombian kidnappers and all that sort of thing. You know, then he started talking about payment for his services, and at that point, I was a little wary, and I explained to him that, you know, we didn't pay for stories, and if he wanted to help us, that was fine. If he didn't, that was fine too. Oddly enough, he calls the very next morning and says, "How would you like to meet the president of Ecuador?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "I have two conditions. One is I want a photo of me shaking hands with the president. And second, I want you to do a favorable restaurant review for my buddy Ivan, who ran a Tex-Mex restaurant in Quito." This is so bizarre. It's impossible to believe. Anyway, so we said yes to the photo, and we said no to the restaurant review. And then we parted ways and agreed to meet, you know, at noon that day or something. Mm-hmm. And I called back to the Journal-Star newsroom, and I said, you know, not quite sure what we're getting into. You know, don't want to get into a dangerous situation. Can you make some phone calls and you know, call the State Department, try to find out who this guy is? A couple hours pass. I get a call back from Peoria. They say, whatever you do, don't go anywhere with this guy. He's a former county sheriff in Virginia. He disappeared without a trace, you know, 10 years ago. You know, his family's been looking for him ever since, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, by that time, we'd spent some time with him, and I thought, well, we'll just play this out and see where it goes. Next thing I know, I'm in the Ecuadorian Oval Office. I'm interviewing Rodrigo Borja in Spanish.
And you knew it was him, right? I mean,
no, we were in the presidential palace, and you know, he tells me that Scott Heimdall is going to be released soon. He was released the next day, 24 hours later, and he also told me that George Bush, the elder, who was then president of the United States, had just given them satellite technology to monitor drug traffic over the Colombian border. So we made local news and we made global news here at the Peoria Journal-Star. It was just a bizarre moment, fascinating story. You know, I was proudest of, at one point, Scott Heimdall's mother, Marge Heimdall, had left the hotel, and so, you know, we needed to speak with her, and so
his family was down there also.
Scott's girlfriend lived in the area, in Quito, and you know, the hardest thing I did was to make phone calls, and entirely in Spanish, where it's very difficult on a phone to, particularly if you're, you know, I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I could get by with Spanish, you know, but doing it on the phone is more difficult. You can't read body language. You can't. Right. And we found where they were staying, and so we went to the house in Quito that night, which was very interesting. Very urban area, you know, dogs barking, dark outside, relatively late at night, you know. They had walls surrounding all these homes with like broken glass embedded in the walls, in the top of the walls, which was a security issue. Mm-hmm. Knocking on doors, which was, you know, that's a very, that's kind of an unnerving thing to do anywhere, but in a foreign country like that.
Oh, no doubt.
So, you know, we did find the family. To no avail, as it turns out. We didn't get an interview, but it was an interesting time. You know, I was glad to see him released. Ross Perot was heavily involved in that. Mm-hmm. He would later run for president.
And of course, Ross Perot was really good friends with Wayne Downing, who's a former Peorian as well, who the airport is named after.
Right, and you know, shoeboxes were passed in Peoria. People went door to door to collect money to pay for Scott's release, and then Scott moved back here for a time, and I think he's back in Ecuador. Last I knew.
I remember I saw Scott Heimdall at Sully's not too long after he came back to town. It looked like he was enjoying his newfound freedom quite a bit. Yeah. How you were there 2 weeks? You said?
Yeah, about 2 weeks, just short of 2 weeks.
Okay. How many stories did you end up doing?
Oh, multiple stories every day. We would work easily 14, 16-hour days.
And this was pre-internet, pre-cell phone, all that sort of thing. So how did you transmit all this stuff back to Peoria? How did you communicate back?
Yeah, the technology was primitive, to say the least. And so at one point, a teleram, what we had was a teleram computer, and that broke down while we were there. And so we flirted with the idea of going out and buying a typewriter and then just faxing the stories back, but we couldn't. We hadn't really thought about this, but it had a Spanish keyboard.
Oh,
and so
I wouldn't think about that either.
A U.S. keyboard, so we couldn't do that. So I ended up transcribing all the stories by phone.
So you were dictating them back to somebody in Peoria?
Yeah, dictating them back to someone in Peoria, and the phone calls, the phone rates were prohibitive. We spent easily $500. Now we're talking 1989 money.
$500 on one phone call?
A single phone call. Yeah.
So
there were multiple phone calls back where I would dictate the stories back here. Sometimes 2, 3, 4 stories a day.
That's an incredible idea to think about that costing that much. And now it's like you could be on the other end of the world with the press of your button.
It was exhausting. I mean, it was really an exhausting thing. And I mean, I lost weight when I was there. It was, Al Harkrader loved the food. I had a difficult time.
Well, Al's always been a little more adventurous. I mean, he went to Vietnam and everything else too. So
yeah.
What did you get much of a chance to see the country at all, or to socialize or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. We went to there was a giant statue, basically kind of like their Statue of Liberty, but of the Virgin Mary. Mm-hmm. And it was, I said we went to the equator. I straddled the equator, and it was a beautiful city, but poor. Interesting things like that. There were some street lights, traffic signals at intersections, but a lot of times people would just drive and they would honk as they approached an intersection, and so it was chaotic in its own way. The other thing that was interesting was, from a work ethic standpoint, we would schedule interviews with government officials, and we would show up, and they wouldn't be there because they had a long lunch or something like that. Mm-hmm. And of course, the nation is soccer crazy.
Oh, I bet.
So Ecuador was playing in the World Cup, and they were doing pretty well. And so people would take off work and go to these parks and set up a black and white television in the park and 100 feet of wire and to connect to an outlet, and 50, 70, 100 people would stand around watching this TV and having a good time.
It's amazing to think, if you went back today, 30 years later or whatever, to see what the changes would be like.
Curious to see what it's like today. Yeah. I would be curious to see what it's like.
And not just, now today, I'm sure you could probably get along in English for the most part in a place like that too, without knowing hardly any Spanish.
Back at the time, Texaco Oil had a huge presence in Ecuador. It was a big oil producing company, and a lot of Texaco executives lived there, and so. It was, it was a fascinating place, beautiful place. The one thing I wish I'd done while I was there is, chartered a plane, not, a commercial plane, and gone to the Galapagos, which is
that would be fantastic.
5 hours off the coast, but as close to Ecuador as any place, I guess. And so, I wish I'd done that just because I was there.
Yeah, when are you ever going to go there again? One of those kind of things.
I don't know what that would have cost. I'm sure I wouldn't have been able to afford it.
Well, I'm looking at the way newsroom budgets and everything has gotten smaller over the years. It's amazing that you could just, Henry Slane or whoever could just sign off on this and say, okay, here's $10,000 or whatever it's going to cost you to go to Ecuador. Go, buy your last second plane ticket and away you go.
At the time, I mean, obviously the state of newspapers today relative to that time. I mean, then it was a license to print money.
Mm-hmm.
Owning a newspaper was, and we had a ESOP, employee stock ownership plan, and everybody was doing very well, and everybody was happy, and times have changed.
Yes, they have, for better or for worse, or better and worse, or maybe just worse. I don't know. But, a few years after this, you said you were offered 3 different editors' positions here, and you picked the opinion page. Why?
Mm-hmm. Because I wanted to write, and I'd continue to be able to write. The others were state desk and city desk, and they were predominantly editing positions. Mm-hmm. Working with staff and all those sorts of things. I thought at the time, and I think rightly in retrospect, that writing was my strength, and I would continue to be able to write. And it was a management position. There were lots of reasons to join the staff over there. It was a real opportunity for me, and so it turned out to be the best of both worlds. It's been a fascinating ride in its own way. It's been a great gig for a long time, and it was a chance to to meet the movers and shakers both in the community, but nationally, internationally. I mean, I had Barack Obama in my office 5 or 6 times. People forget he was a U.S. Senator from Illinois, of course. Newt Gingrich would come here. The Israeli consulate would send somebody here every year. You know, I interviewed South Korea's ambassador to the United States, former president of South Korea here, you know, during the negotiations for the South Korean trade agreement, that sort of thing. I mean, Peoria is very much, as we've said so many times, hub of the universe. And you know, it goes all the way back to the Richard Nixon era, and will it play in Peoria and all of that. And so, you know, it's been a pretty special place for a newspaper this size, and you really wouldn't find that, you know, in many newspapers this size across the country.
I think that's very true. It's you know, I hate to toot
it
our
helped
horn.
to have a
like
Fortune
this,
50 company here, right? I mean,
certainly.
all of those sorts of things. And Peoria's always had a bit of an international flavor, you know, and a really rich history.
Oh, extremely so. When you write an editorial, I mean, how do you go about doing it? You have to think of a topic, you do the research. I mean, how does it all work?
Sure. So yeah, you know, one of the things that I have here that's a real benefit is the institutional history, and so I always talk about how I may be alone now. I mean, there was a time when the editorial board was, I mean, I can't go back 50 years, but I don't know what the size of the editorial board was then, but it went from 4 to 3. It was 3 for a long time.
Well, because you work with Shelley Epstein and Barb Drake, correct?
Barb Drake was the opinion page editor. And then it went to 2 for a time, and then it went to just me. But I always say that, you know, whenever you know, we used to have story conferences in the morning, so now I don't, obviously, so I talk to myself. But, you know, there are always ghosts sitting around the table with me, and so the Journal-Star has a history of falling this or that way on any given issue, and those issues cover the board. Cover the gamut, and so I you know, I know what the Journal-Star's position is on those issues, and while you know, you may move the meter just a bit, but the reality is that, you know, you don't have a position on guns, for example, or abortion, or any number of issues, financial issues, budget, deficit, whatever the case may be. You don't, and it's not here one day and then 180 degrees the opposite the next. That's not the way it works. There has to be a certain consistency. And so all those editors going back 40 years, whom I have known here, are sort of whispering in my ear, this is where we are, this is who we've been. So, you know, uniquely at this paper, I speak for the newspaper. That is my job. I don't speak for myself in that spot on the left-hand side of the paper. I speak for the Journal-Star. And so the Journal-Star has that history of landing certain ways on certain subjects. And that has not changed dramatically. As I said, you know, I mean, bring my own personality to that a little bit. And I would say, I mean, the Journal-Star has been, at times, you know, in its evolution, a bit to the right, a bit to the left. I would say now, today, that, and I use this term a lot, is I think we're militantly moderate, and I think that's reflected in our endorsements and our positions on lots and lots of issues. And that's, to some degree, a reflection of my own personality and stances on things. But again, you know, you're always going to be faithful to that institutional history. So I bring, you know, I bring the institutional knowledge and that history. I've lived here in Peoria for more than 3 decades. I have I think a good feel for the community. I grew up in Springfield. I went to college in Bloomington Normal. I moved to Peoria, sort of the golden triangle of Central Illinois, right?
Such as it is.
Yeah, or the Bermuda Triangle of Central Illinois. You know, I know downstate Illinois pretty well. You know, as with anything, you know, you apply your journalism skills to the job as well and to those issues. You know, you don't know everything. I mean, you're not, you know, this is not a large metro newspaper where you have, you know, maybe an editorial writer devoted just to the environment or just to economic matters or just to state government. I mean, you have to be a jack of all trades here to some degree. And I've written about all of these subjects over many, many years. And so, you know, I have a background there. And, you know, I would never pretend that I'm an expert on any given issue, but I know where the experts are. And so that's where the journalism part of it comes in. You call those people, you deal with those people, you pick their brains.
You just don't write something just off the
Not
top of
writing
your
off the top
head.
of my head, you know. But, you know, I mean, the realities of today in journalism is that, you know, there's always pressure to produce copy and produce it quickly, and there's less time than ever to do that, and fewer resources being applied to do that. So you have to be able to write quickly and on deadline. And so it really helps to have that history, to have that sense of where we are on this subject. And there are certain issues I revisit all the time. Central economic development practice in Central Illinois. Our dysfunctional state government. Schools have always been an interest of mine. I mean, I know those issues. I don't want to say inside and out, but I know them pretty well, and I know where to get the information if I don't. And so we revisit those issues. History repeats itself, and so
pretty much.
Yeah, and so I can sit down and jot off something pretty quickly these days. Certainly the research you do. I mean, you do a ton of reading, just an absolute ton of reading. And you know who the influential people are in the region. Both those we elect to local government, those we elect to state government, those we elect to the federal government. It's a great resource. It's a great thing when I can write about Allegiant Airlines, the 60 Minutes piece.
Sure.
Questioning how safe those flights were recently. I mean, it's a great resource when I can call Ray LaHood up, and he'll take my phone call.
Former Secretary of Transportation and Peoria resident.
Former congressman. But in this case specifically, his experience as transportation secretary, and that's a great thing to have. And so I have a lot of history with those people, and I can call them, and they recognize the name, and they'll talk to you, and so that helps. Those things all help.
How much do you take your audience's opinions or how they might react to an editorial into account when you write something? I mean, sometimes you get a lot of blowback maybe on some things. I mean, does it influence the way you present an editorial one way or the other?
The blowback goes with the territory, in the opinion page business, that you're probably going to irritate half the people.
Yep.
Certainly true when you do endorsements or any controversial matter. Do I take it into account? Sure, because one of the things I'm trying to do is anticipate the arguments of the other side. It's in some ways it's like being an attorney but making a lot less money. As an attorney you have to be able to argue both sides of an issue, and so I pride myself on that. I know what the opposing arguments are, and I can make those arguments. But we're going to be true to the Journal-Star's position of landing certain ways on certain subjects. I'm going to try to be fair. And some people may disagree with this, but I'm going to try to be very respectful of the audience. Okay, and one of the things I really hate about this era in media, the screaming matches, trying to shout out the other side. I just don't think that's productive, and I try to steer away from the screaming and name calling to the degree possible. Everybody's human.
Sure.
People lose their tempers. I get it, but I do try to acknowledge that there's another side, that there's another argument, but this is where we stand, and this is why. And again, it may not necessarily be my opinion. I've certainly written editorials that I was not entirely on board with, probably. And that if it was just me and I wasn't writing for the newspaper but writing for Mike Bailey, I might reach a different conclusion.
Sure.
But again, those positions have evolved. They've been crafted over many, many decades, and so this is who we are, and this is what we stand for. And certainly behind the scenes here, even in endorsement interviews, and I will acknowledge this if in an endorsement, if there's disagreement on the editorial board about this or that candidate. This is ultimately this is what our consensus was, but we weren't. There was some disagreement here.
I was going to ask you about that. How do you go about making political endorsements? We get it. We get a view of the candidates that absolutely no one else does, because the vast majority of them come in to the Journal-Star, come into our offices for face-to-face interviews. From the governor, U.S. Senate, yep. Local congressman, city council, county clerk, you name it, school board members, school board candidates, the whole thing. Yeah, I've sat in on a few of those myself.
And that gives you a perspective that the vast majority of our readers never get. Okay, I'll talk a lot about how we never endorsed Rod Blagojevich in any election. We had 4 cracks at him. We never even endorsed him in a Democratic primary. And I think that if you had sat in the same room with him, you would have gotten a very different view of him than evidently most voters had of him. And so people will say to me, I think people misunderstand endorsements because they view it as You know, endorsements are preferences, not predictions. We know going in sometimes that, you know, our endorsement is going to lose. You know, I mean, that has happened on multiple occasions. That's not relevant to the endorsement. We are trying, honestly, you know, if you're going to run an honest opinion page, you know, we pick the candidate we think is best. And we have to pick from what's on the shelf. You know, I don't get to pick the ideal candidate.
You can't, take position from this one and a position from that one and kind of mold them all together into one.
And, you know, I see a lot of newspapers like to sit out endorsements because, you know, they are controversial and they may cost you subscriptions. You know, I think voters have to make a choice, and I think we as a newspaper have an obligation to make a choice as well, even if the choices are not good ones. You know, I think we said that, so I might as well say it now. You know, we didn't think we had a great choice in the 2016 presidential election. You know, as I said, there's disagreement. You know, certainly I am in every interview with all of the candidates, and you know, no endorsement is ever based on a single interview. You know, some people give great interviews and they're terrible as elected officials, and so you know the people. You know, so you call the people who work with them every day. You know, and that really gives you the glimpse you need. You know, one of the things I've discovered over the years is that, you know, character is destiny and character matters, and that's one thing that, you know, that has really I've come to that over 30 years of experience, and I'm not sure as a very young opinion page sub-editor, that I appreciated that the way I do now as a 57-year-old opinion page editor. I mean, that character matters more than anything, and if we elect people who lack character, we get what we deserve, and usually it ends badly. But anyway, I meet with all of them. I do the background interviews. I read as much as I can about them. You know, we go into the editorial board, which would be me, Dennis Anderson, who's our executive editor, Ken Mauser, who's our publisher, and we sit down, we hash it out, and we try to reach consensus. And I can in some. There's been, you know, it's never bitter disagreement. I mean, the publisher always has more votes than anybody at the table if he wants to exercise them. But, you know, you try to reach consensus, and we try to reach an agreement. And there have been some. I remember one presidential election in particular. I remember we went back and forth, I want to say 8 or 9 hours over multiple days before we were able to reach an agreement, you know. And so, and then you endorse for better or worse. And some people, you know, people can surprise you sometimes, you know, and sometimes in retrospect you look back and you think, well, we made the right call there. And other times you say, missed on that one, you know. Some people resent endorsements because they think it's the paper telling them what to do, and it's really not. The Journal Star is but one voice in the community among many. And it is a traditional role of newspapers. And as I said, I think we also have a perspective that the vast majority of voters never have. And so I think that our guidance, our recommendations, have some value. But it gets harder and harder over time.
Yeah, do you ever foresee a time when the paper will not endorse candidates?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know what I can't speak specifically to the Journal Star. I'm not sure that, you know, you know, I'm 57. I won't be here forever. You know, who knows what happens after I leave. You know, I think, you know, many newspapers, because like any business, they're profit driven. You know, endorsements can alienate customers, and I think people get gun shy of that. I would argue that from a long-term business perspective, that it is best to have an editorial page that stands for something, that is provocative, that makes people think, that takes a stand. And I think that's good for business in the long run. I don't think you want to bore people to death, because if you do that, that's the best way to lose customers.
Give them a reason to read.
That's right. You got to give
them.
They
may not like it every time.
They may disagree with you, and we can respectfully disagree, and that's what makes America a great nation.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So anyway,
what's the biggest response or the biggest feedback you've gotten from an editorial that you've written that you can recall?
Oh golly. You know, Donald Trump's a lightning rod, so just about everything we wrote in the 2016 campaign leading up to it got a ton of reaction.
Both ways?
Yes, both ways. Much of it was quite hostile. Anytime you write about a subject like guns, you know, gosh, it has never become less controversial. And, you know, in the more than 30 years I've been here, that has always been a big issue. abortion's a big issue. It's a moral issue, and people have very strong feelings about that, not only in Peoria but nationally, obviously. I can remember the CAT UAW dispute back in the 1990s, which is really hinged in the history of the American labor movement. And Caterpillar hired replacement workers, but the strike went on for 6 years or more. The community was very, very divided. And the General Star took a very middle ground there, despite being lobbied by both sides to take their side. Our position was then that we were taking the community side, and it was in the best interest of the community to resolve this dispute as quickly as possible, which did not happen. So those all generate a ton of feedback. Anytime you write about kids, and tragedy, you get a lot of feedback on those sorts of issues. A lot of times, people respond on an ideological basis, and so the General Star is a lot of things to a lot of people. And as I said, from my perspective, and I think I can prove this, we're pretty much militantly moderate now. But if you're so far to the right that the whole rest of planet Earth is to your left, then yeah, we're liberal by comparison. And conversely, if you're so far to the left, the whole rest of planet Earth is to your right, then we're conservative by comparison. So, I've always been amazed by people who could read the same editorial, the exact same editorial, the exact same words, and come away with polar opposite conclusions about what we just said.
At the same time, that also means maybe you're doing it correctly.
Could be. I mean, hard to say, but I mean, whether we're liberal or conservative largely depends on the person asking that question. It depends on them more than it depends on us in a lot of ways. My perspective, we're slightly to the right on fiscal issues, budgets and that sort of thing. And we're slightly to the left on social issues. And I think that's, for the most part, where most of Central Illinois is. I think that's where most of the 18th Congressional District voters are. Maybe not most, particularly on the social issues. And it depends on where you are within the 18th District. But certainly in the Peoria area, I think that, we reflect the area. And, I'll probably get, certainly there are pockets of disagreement. In the dozen years now, I can't believe it's been this much time, that I've been in charge of the page, our endorsements have been almost 50-50 Democrat-Republican. They have tended to be slightly more Republicans,
But this is slightly more Republican area at the same time.
Could be. I mean, we have not endorsed a Republican for governor in almost 30 years. We'll see this fall. We'll see this coming year how that turns out. But it's been a long time. Don Clark Netsch was the last Democrat we endorsed for governor. And it's fascinating, when I talk about the really up close and personal view we get of all the governors we've had in and how they were different. I could analyze all of them, but for president, we endorsed George W. Bush twice, and we endorsed Barack Obama the first time. We endorsed Mitt Romney in 2012. We endorsed Hillary Clinton this past year, or in 2016. So. There was a time, it predates me, the Journal Star endorsed the Libertarian for president.
It was 1980, I believe.
1980, yeah. Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. Yeah, and so now there's probably a lot of movement there, and people will say, well, you're not being very consistent. Well, we are and we aren't. I mean, there's, when you meet people and you get a sense of who they are and, not only what kind of character they bring to the job, but their intellectual capacity, all sorts of different things. Their potential for emotional leadership, the EQ, all sorts of things that you get a sense of that many other people don't. And sometimes, as I said, we've endorsed has never ceased to amaze me in some ways, particularly in some local races, where people we have endorsed and voters have made a beeline for the other candidate. Which is
just based on the endorsement.
Well, the Journal Star kiss of death, right? No, I think far more than an endorsement. I think name recognition matters. I think personal relationships matter. People go to the polls and they vote for the guy that their family has known for years and years and years, and he's a likable guy, and they may not know anything necessarily about his position on the issues, or her position on the issues, but that they know that person and they like that person, and that's who they're voting for, come hell or high water. And so
I think there was a good case of that in the Peoria Township supervisor's election this last time when Frank Abner, who ended up winning the race, ran for it. You own a popular restaurant for 30 years, you build up a lot of goodwill, and that can overcome just about anything.
Yeah, we stayed out of that race because we had some personal conflicts there, and so we did not endorse in that race. Sometimes readers and voters disagree with us, and that's fine.
That's what makes the world go
That's
around, right?
That's
Indeed.
right.
I'm going to shift gears here just a little bit. Maybe we'll get in a little bit of like an editorial situation now. I mean, what do you think is the biggest issue that this city is facing now and maybe down the road a little bit too?
Well, I am very, very, very concerned about the future of downstate Illinois, and so that's not just Peoria. But Caterpillar's departure from Peoria, moving its headquarters to Deerfield, ADM's departure from Decatur. There's a lot of talk going on over in Bloomington Normal about State Farm's future there. It seems like forever that many of the state's largest employers were in downstate Illinois, and now young people don't go where the job is; they go where the lifestyle they want is, and the jobs follow them. There's not a single gubernatorial candidate, from my perspective, who is really pounding this issue, about the economic future and the economic health of downstate Illinois. I mean, there is tremendous imbalance in Illinois. All the wealth, all the influence, all the political power is concentrated in its northeast corner, and we're a big state. And Illinois would be a healthier state if that was spread out, if there was greater population balance, greater wealth balance, all those sorts of things. I am very, very concerned about the future of downstate Illinois, and I fear in some ways that local leadership may not quite appreciate that, and if they do appreciate, it's a difficult thing, they're not sure what to do about that. And I think economic development incentives, certainly in the way we've used them and exploited them in the past, are the wrong way going forward. Philosophically opposed to those. Pragmatically, I don't think they work. Philosophically, I don't think local government has any business picking winners and losers in a free market.
Are you talking specifically about the issues with the downtown hotel project, or is there other
you
ones
name
too?
It. I think the downtown hotel. The new hot dog restaurant.
I paid the extra tax yesterday when I went over there.
Yeah,
it was delicious.
I don't think that you incent minimum wage jobs. I don't think that's economic development. I don't think it moves the community forward. When you bring head of household jobs to a community, people have disposable income, and those other issues take care of themselves because they have disposable income to spend on restaurants and entertainment and all those sorts of things. To me, we've got that whole economic development thing upside down. Workforce development is a critical issue. A lot of these economic development incentives punish school districts, for example.
TIF districts, for example.
That's completely wrong-headed, right? Employer after employer after employer tells me, and has told us for decades, that they need more qualified workers walking in the door, and so why would you punish local school districts that are producing that next generation workforce? If employers feel those young people lack the skills that they need, that's a real problem for this community moving forward. And I've talked a lot about the struggles of the Peoria Public Schools. And years ago, I talked about it being the canary in the coal mine, and that there was an economic component to that. That employers wouldn't jump to the first cornfield across the river. They would leave the region altogether, because jumping to the first cornfield across the river doesn't buy you access to a better airport or access to a better workforce or any of those sorts of things that employers need to be successful, right? They leave the region altogether. And, we've seen Caterpillar, for example, head to other pastures. I am saddened that some of those predictions from 30 years ago now have come true in some ways. And, moving forward, this is a really, really critical issue.
What's an answer? Not even the answer, but what's an answer? How can
I think that education is the answer to a lot of things. I think you have to invest in education, or at least not punish it. And families are the answer. Young people. We need a culture that values education, that sends children into a classroom from day one, prepared to learn. Those are all critical issues, and those are neighborhood issues, and those are when a family is. When a head of a household is working 3 jobs and has 5 kids at home, it's difficult to attend to that young child, or any one of those children. And so we've got to make their lives, and the community must pull in this direction. But first and foremost, it's the responsibility of the parents. But we've got to make their lives as stable and secure as possible for their sake, first and foremost, and for the community's sake. We've got to have, we can't send, we send young people here away to college. We want them to come back home, not just Peoria, but Illinois is suffering a real brain drain there, as we've really starved our higher education system. Illinois, I think, leads the nation or is close to it in out migration of college students.
I believe that's correct.
If you go to school out of state, you're far less likely to come back home to Peoria. I also think that the Peoria area has to decide, has to play to its strengths, and manufacturing going forward may or may not be that strength. People talk a lot about the growth of the healthcare industry here, and that's a great thing, but will that industry remain vibrant if a lot of other jobs leave? Caterpillar still employs a lot of people here, but if in 10 years from now that's no longer the case, does Central Illinois still have 3 hospitals? Does it still have, all that it offers now? We're not going to land another Fortune 50 company here. I think that's exceedingly unlikely.
Yes.
But we need to bring in, or grow our own, which is much more important. We need much more of an entrepreneurial culture here in a lot of ways. But we need to bring in 20 businesses that add up to what Caterpillar was here.
Yeah, it's not going to be just one big business. It's going to be a lot of smaller ones.
And so, what are our strengths? Our strengths are healthcare, agriculture. We need to play to those. It's really frustrating to me that we have the nation's largest ag lab right on our doorstep here in Peoria. It's created, $5-6 billion industries over the last 50, 60 years.
Penicillin for commercial use was developed.
And yet, there are no jobs outside that building. We have the scientists, and we're lucky to have them, and I'm glad we do. And the federal government frequently takes another run at closing that facility every few years. But, we need that research coming out of that facility needs to turn into jobs here. In my view, and we need to find a way to do that. We need to find a way to help people do that. You do that with investment capital. The investment capital tends to be on the coast. That research goes to the coast. It's located in the heart of America here in the Midwest, and we need more jobs here in the Midwest. Same is true of the U of I, which is a fantastic asset, right? In Champaign-Urbana, supercomputer. It's
sure.
Great, fantastic engineering school. It attracts and it graduates very, very, very bright people. We need them to be applying their talents here in Central Illinois, and certainly in Illinois someplace. And so why isn't there an I-74 high-tech corridor between Champaign and the Quad Cities? Why doesn't that exist? Why can't the local political leadership in each of those communities band together in some ways and see that we all win? Instead, we tend to compete with one another. And so we fight over this sort of shrinking pie. We need to grow that pie for everybody, and we need to applaud when one community gets a big win.
And that leads me to the next question. It's like, what role, if any, does local government have in any of this? I guess maybe not to give $7 million or whatever it is to Gary Matthews, or what do they? What can
government's
they do?
role is to create the environment that is conducive to economic growth, right? And I in so many ways, local governments are between a rock and a hard place now, because they've got pension liabilities, they've got obligations to maintain streets, and to employ firefighters and police officers and teachers, and they simply don't have the resources to do that. And the more they raise taxes, you know, they make that situation for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
People are free to leave, and so, you know, there's a balance there. You need to have a tax load that is necessary to provide critical services, basic services, but not much more than that, because, you know, drives people away. I mean, Illinois, Peoria is in a competitive environment, and people have proven in Illinois that they're willing to lead the state. You know, they want stability in their government. They want competence in their government. And so you need to have all those sorts of things. And so I think government's relatively limited. You know, it's easier on some of the things they should not do, which
Mm-hmm.
is, you know, incentivize a restaurant or incentivize another retail establishment. I mean, that we've seen where that's led. You know, sales tax revenues are flat or declining, despite all of these inducements. If these inducements worked, and we've been at this for 40 years, right, we'd be booming. We're not booming.
I take it I won't be seeing you at Portillo's anytime soon?
You know, I love Portillo's. My wife's from Chicago. We visited Portillo's many times. You know, I will probably go in and have a hot dog or Italian beef or great chopped salad too.
Yes, their chopped salad is very underrated.
But I thought the public assistance provided was inappropriate, and I still believe that. That's not economic development. That's not how you build an economy.
Two quick things to wrap up here. One's kind of serious, one's kind of frivolous. Who's going to win the governor's race?
Ha ha! Remember, endorsements are preferences, not predictions. You know, I think I think it's a mistake to predict the future. Well, the one thing Tom Driscoll, who hired me at this paper, former opinion page editor, said, "Young man, never predict the future." I think it's going to be a close race. I think. Why don't I do this? I'll outline the challenges I think each candidate has.
That's fair.
I think Bruce Rauner will have a difficult time running on his record. Even if you think he's got the right ideas to turn Illinois around, he has been wholly ineffective in accomplishing and implementing those ideas. And obviously, he faces a brick wall in the legislature in a lot of ways. I think the governing there, the disputes have become all too personal. And I think he needs to recognize, and should have recognized when he came into office, that he was not the CEO of Illinois, that there was another arm of government that...
and a very strong arm of government at that.
A very strong Speaker of the House in Mike Madigan, who wields every bit as much power, if not more so, than the governor does, whoever the governor is. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we went almost 3 years without a budget. I think that speaks for itself. I also think that the governor has angered an element of his base, with his signing of the bill regarding abortion, and providing public money for that. Illinois, beyond that, Illinois is a blue state to begin with. Okay, so there are fewer Republican voters than Democratic voters from the start,
Mm-hmm.
before anybody goes to the polls. And so he needs all the Republican voters who can go to the polls that he possibly can. J.B. Pritzker is a relative newcomer to politics. He's been in and around that scene for a very long time, but never held elective office before. We endorsed Chris Kennedy in that race for a variety of reasons.
Former Peoria resident Chris Kennedy.
Yes, for a short time.
Yeah.
I think that the government. I think it's going to be one of the nastiest campaigns in history, and likely the most expensive gubernatorial campaign in American history. You have two billionaires effectively who spent a lot of their own money. Mm-hmm. I think the governor's ads regarding Pritzker and his connections, whatever they were, to Rod Blagojevich, hurt Pritzker. And I think that the governor is going to pound home Pritzker's relationship with Madigan, whether there really is one or not. I think we're going to hear that over and over and over again. Madigan is not a popular guy. Certainly public opinion polls would suggest that, and especially in downstate Illinois. So I think, Pritzker's going to have to address that, confront that at some point. I think he could create some distance for himself and distinguished himself, frankly, and I wrote this last week in an editorial, by coming out very strongly in favor of the redistricting amendment, which I think is maybe the most important thing on the ballot in the fall, far more important than who the next governor is or anything. If we can't fix that, if we can't get fair maps, I'm not sure Illinois can be fixed, quite frankly. 2/3 of all legislative races in 2014 went, and in 2016 too, I believe, but 2/3 went unopposed. There were like 7 legislative races on the ballot here in the Peoria area. All of them had one name on the ballot. That is not democracy.
Yeah, the maps look like something out of a Rorschach test.
That's right. That's right. And so if you don't, having a choice is critical to democracy. It's the very essence of it. And having that choice enforces accountability on our elected leaders. And, if the fix is in, if they're going to win no matter what they do, there's no reason for them to be accountable. And what happens ultimately is that they become accountable to their fringes. The people who show up in a primary election, not in a general election. That's not healthy for the state. And we've seen the results of that. I mean, it is embarrassing to me as an Illinois native that Illinois is ranked bottom of the barrel, last or nearly so, in darn near every category. Budget, pension liabilities, you name it. Illinois is a resource-rich state. It's a large state, 6th in population.
It's got one of the greatest cities in the world.
It's a relatively wealthy state. It's one of fewer than a handful of world-class cities in this country, in America.
It's a transportation hub. It's an agricultural hub.
We have everything going for us. And 40 years ago, Illinois was a powerhouse. What happened? The greatest liability Illinois has is its legislature. That's what's broken, is our elected leadership. That's fundamentally broken. And it's inexcusable. And it is striking to me that voters won't make changes. Now, it's a problem if they don't have a choice, right? It's a really choice, I will say this, too, coming out after the last election. And so you didn't ask me about this, but the whole fake news thing, right, which I think is a threat to the republic. Informed voters are critical to any democracy, and we're a republic, representative democracy, but they're critical, and it's alarming in the extreme to me that so many people in 2016 in particular were so eager to believe practically anything if it was consistent with their own preconceived agenda. I heard from, this has just gotten out of control. I can't tell you the number of people who call me to swear that Barack Obama had sworn his oath on the Quran. That is so patently false. From a common sense perspective, it makes zero sense, right? On its face, that's wrong. Think of all the eyewitnesses, including the Chief Justice of the U.S.
He's standing there holding the book,
who administered the oath, right? Somebody had photoshopped that, doctored it online, and sent out that photo. And, you just can't, you're talking to people and they come predisposed not to believe you. That puts us in very, very dangerous territory. Beyond that, I would say I was shocked and, again, alarmed about the level of civics illiteracy in the United States. And I'm not talking about just kids, young people, students. I'm talking about people in their 50s and 60s who, had no appreciation for the separation of powers, really did not know the Bill of Rights, who think the federal judiciary works for the president. Those are fundamental things. Elemental.
I think some people would prefer to have a dictator as long as it was their dictator.
It was extraordinary to me and disappointing, just disappointing. Anyway, so there you have it.
Let's end on a little more lighthearted note.
Yes.
Who's going to win the National League Central this year?
Well,
or maybe this won't be lighthearted. I don't know.
I have a number of wagers here. So some background. So I grew up in Springfield, which is the true Cub Cardinal line. It's a 50-50 town. And my best friend, and I'll never forget 1969, which, in 67 and 68, the Cardinals had gone to the World Series, and they won in 67 and lost in 68. But they were the powerhouse when I was growing up. And my very best friend lived directly across the street, best man at my wedding, and just bled Cubby blue. The whole family did, and we would have dueling signs across the yard. Cubs stink, Cards stink. But we were best friends, but '69, the Cardinals didn't get to the World Series, obviously, but it was one of the best summers of my life because the Cubs just collapsed.
Oh, jeez.
But I don't hate the Cubs. So I'm married. I have a true mixed marriage. My wife is again a big Cub fan. Her father was an eyewitness to Babe Ruth calling the shot in the World Series. It was at Wrigley Field in 1932, I believe.
Sounds right, 32 or 33, something like that. And
was an eyewitness to that. She was, bleacher bum back when, you remember when the Cub fans wore hard hats in the bleachers back in '69. And so, she just loves the Cubs, and I love her. But I remain a Cardinal fan. And so, anyway, who's going to win? Well, the Cubs, on paper would seem to be the likely candidate, but I would not underestimate the Cardinals. They have a lot of really good young talent now. Injuries could make a difference there, particularly to pitching, but very deep in the bullpen. They seem to have found a closer. They've got some good young hitters. Mm-hmm. If they perform up to their potential, it's going to be, what I do think is fun is a real pennant race between the Cubs and the Cardinals.
I think that's great.
I enjoy that, and that's it's all good fun. It's
Oh sure.
Yeah. So
I've always maintained that you could put a Cardinals uniform on a sack of manure and that thing would hit 320 and have 35 homers.
There's something magic about the two Redbirds perched on the bat. What can I say?
It's disgusting. Maybe the Brewers will win it and they'll just invalidate both of us this year. Who knows?
DeYoung at shortstop's going to hit at least 35, maybe 40. Ozuna's going to get into gear pretty soon. Cardinals going to hit a lot of home runs. They were never a home run hitting team when I was growing up. They were speed and Whitey Ball and all that sort of thing. I go back to Red Shane-Danes and Lou Brock. I love Lou Brock. I love Bob Gibson, all those great players. And so it's great to see a real race. But I think the Cardinals are going to be in it. I do. I think it'll be very tight. I mean, particularly if 92, 93 games win that division.
I'd agree.
I think it'll be very tight. I think, the Cubs are better than a 500 team, which is what they're playing now. They'll be fine. Their pitching is suspect, I think.
I think the starting pitching is certainly suspect at this point. I think their relievers are pretty decent.
I would trade Schwarber to the American League, where he belongs, because he's a DH, and for a top shelf starting pitcher. But they make his stock was probably higher 2 years ago than it is right now.
I'm sure.
But I'm not telling Theo Epstein anything he doesn't already know.
Well,
but if he'd like my assistance, I'd be glad to advise him
for a small fee,
with
right?
an eye toward making them less competitive than they are now.
It'll be a lot more fun watching the baseball playoffs than we'll be probably watching the political things this year. There's no doubt about that.
That's right.
Mike Bailey, thank you very much for being here today. It was very fun.
You're welcome anytime. It was the Nick and Mike show, right?
Yes. So we'll do this again down the road at some point.
I suppose.
Absolutely. So thank you, and thank you for watching and listening on Nick in the Morning, the podcast. We'll see you again next time.
Thanks.